Opening opposition.
Isaac, Sean, you will be going first. Isaac will be going second. Neutral pronouns are preferred. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Closing government. CG.
Yeah, Iman going first, she, her.
And Eva speaking second, she or they.
Thank you very much. Closing opposition.
Trey speaking first, he or they is fine.
And Preston speaking second, he or they.
Thank you very much, everyone. Please heed those preferred gender pronouns. Just two really quick reminders for all teams to please use your own timer. Definitely will share the timing signals in chat, but probably not exactly on the second, so you'll still have your own timer to fall back. And I think this will be useful to be used in other speakers as well, just so that you know when it is appropriate to ask POIs to the opposing bench. Number two is please use the chat function in Zoom to as a default mode of offering POI to the opposing bench. But if any speaker prefers other methods by which POI should be offered to them, feel free to indicate that before you start your speech. The usual speaking time is still 7 minutes, as is customary in this format. So I guess if there's no other questions, if any, feel free to ask them right now. Good. If not, then we can start the round under the motion that reads, "This House regrets the increasing emphasis upon publicity and performative expressivism in social movements." I'd like to invite the Honorable Prime Minister to open their case. You're here.
Sorry, 1 second.
No worries.
Okay, cool. Okay, I'll start now. One of the most regrettable issues with social movements in the current century is that they create change that doesn't actually help those who need it most. So in my speech, I'm just going to talk simply about two things. Firstly, I want to discuss how this affects the perceptions and the number of committed supporters of social movements. Oh. Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. Should I just I'll just restart, I guess, because sure. It's okay.
No worries.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. One of the most regrettable facets of social movements currently right now is that they lose a lot of the political capital and a lot of the change that they could be creating to performative expressivism. So I'm just going to talk about two things, right? Firstly, I want to talk about how this affects the perceptions of and the number of committed supporters to social movements right now. And secondly, I want to discuss what the counterfactual looks like and why comparatively we're much more likely going to get practical change for the people who need it most on our side. Firstly, then, I just want to talk about how this affects the perceptions and the number of committed supporters of the movement. I want to talk about a few things under this, right? Firstly, I want to point out that we have to recognize that performative displays are almost always subject to network effects, right? And note that this is probably the link that both sides are going to use to link into their impacts, right? Social movements rely on people in a centralized core setting to set the pace for discourse of more peripheral members. This is because in the 21st century, there are active incentives for them to assume hierarchical structures in order to effectively organize large groups of people over things like the internet. The dominant mode of sharing information in the 21st century tends to be social media, which in and of itself is subject to network effects. That is, your post is more likely going to be seen if other people are posting about the same thing using similar hashtags, retweeting your content, etc. What this means is that you will likely get a barrage of similar displays of performative expressionism by millions of people. Things like the black squares on Instagram or the same social media post being shared by tens of thousands of people. We think that the messages that will actually be achieved by these network effects are not necessarily the ones that are actually best suited to win over moderate bases of support and expand the coalition. And note that this is important for a few reasons, right? Important because in general, when you want to create change, the base that is most heavily afflicted by your social movement is almost always likely going to be willing to support it, vote for it, contribute to it. The change that needs to happen, obviously, is in the moderates, right? And this is important for a few reasons, right? Firstly, note that the core of these movements tend to be far more plugged into a more radical version of activist politics than the median supporter of said movements. While they might believe that a certain radical performative expressionism represents them, it's probably not designed to cater to the person on the margin of joining. The key is that once content flows from the core outward, this is what everybody sees. But secondly, social media in and of itself is insular and tends to form ideological echo chambers, right? The activists on the internet tend to skew younger and more progressive, but are also in social media bubbles that tend to confirm the fullest form of their existing views because of the algorithms behind these things. Thus, the expressions they put out cater to their immediate bubble, but end up spreading like wildfire through the mechanisms of social media, and millions are eventually exposed to them because of people's will for performative expressionism. Like, the issue here then is that this harms the movement because the content you get is not actually what people need to see for two key reasons. Firstly, moderate individuals are probably more averse to radical expressions of identitarianism than they are to subjective critiques of the system and information about the real world issues that need to be addressed. Things like videos or facts about police brutality or discrete actions they can take, like donating to bail funds. If the content they see is predominantly focused on themes that they cannot resonate with or see as directly equating to substantive change, they're less likely to invest time and mental energy to learn about these issues and join the movement. But secondly, people are more likely going to see these expressions as performative as opposed to practical. When millions of people, both inside and outside the movement, share the same black square, but do not meaningfully contribute in the same way when it comes to substantive discussions over policy change or information about attending marches or donation funds, we do think that some content crowds out others, right? And that sensationalist displays get more attention than substantive critiques. All of this necessarily means that people don't see the movement as efficacious and rather write them off as predominantly aesthetic. Thus, even members of the movement themselves are likely going to become disenchanted and often bow out or become less engaged. The weighing under this is that you're less likely going to be able to achieve critical masses of support on our side of the house. Firstly, we think that every additional supporter who is plugged in for the right reasons is another person who donates, who signs petitions, who votes. When you create the norm that being a part of the movement is more about aesthetics than about action, even if they do get members, their members don't feel the obligation to take steps beyond the sharing of a post so you don't get change. But secondly, attaining a sufficient critical mass is crucial for those in power to see you as a well-off organized interest bloc. That can hold them accountable if they do not prioritize the issues that you care about. Politicians don't care particularly what teenagers share on media, but they do fear protests outside of their office or strikes in their cities or marches in their streets, less people committed to material action or less change. Fundamentally, what we basically are saying here is that performative actions oftentimes will break down the ability for a long-term sustainable movement to actually be able to create change, and at best create a flare of temporary supporters who don't actually do the meaningful things that can create change for people. What do we think then is the counterfactual, right? We do defend using social media and public displays based on substantive confrontation of these issues, right? Social media should use these platforms to reach out to more people by sharing information about the problems they aim to solve, e.g. mass retweeting of proof or voter suppression, videos of the death of George Floyd, etc., and to coordinate actual activism, things like protests, strikes, national marches. We think that we still get access to the advantages they talk about in terms of information, right? There's like mass protests in the street, news media picks it up and covers this. This gives activists a real platform to talk about and share lived experiences with nuance, and this coverage is probably the best outlet to reach lots of people, given that social media is still subject to the echo chamber algorithms. But we also think, importantly here, that we just have more substantive actions on our side. We think that participation in these substantive actions makes people feel efficacious. They feel less alienated from the movement, and that's when they're most likely going to make meaningful contribution. Before I keep going on, POY?
It seems like a lot of the alternatives that you want are actually things for up, like going to protests, taking pictures at protests. All those types of things seem quite public to me, not quite private.
Okay, so here's the thing, right? I think in general, there are different purposes to the same mechanisms. I think the way in which we change it is like the reasoning and the narratives behind how people end up doing the things that they end up doing, which means, sure, there might be an overlap in action between the two worlds, but we get less of the people who are just, posting a black square and pretending like they're an ally and ignoring everything for the rest of their life, and more of the people who, both sides might go to the protest, but more of the people who actually contribute to demonstrate this meaningful action into the future. Note here, right? Like, Op is probably just going to say that like on flat, this awareness is going to be beneficial. I just want to quickly do a little bit of weighing, right? Even in their best case, if you have like 50% of the people around you as a minority who is oppressed, even if you get 50% of the people around you telling you that you're an ally, your daily experiences don't actually change other than seeing the demonstrative effects around you. You don't actually, not only do you not like get substantial benefit, but oftentimes it's an actual harm, right? It's the disaffection towards these social movements. It's the feeling as though nobody is ever actually going to change the ways that you think are important to change. On our side, sure, maybe 75% of the people are going to, who have mistreated you, stay silent. But we think that when you get a substantial portion of the people who are willing to change actually changing, and instead of doing this, doing meaningful things, it actually helps your lives. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for our Prime Minister for those remarks. To open opposition's case in this debate, Leader of Opposition, please. Here.
Thanks, Sophie. Can you hear me?
Yep, very clear.
Okay, give me a moment. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the first thing I want to do in this debate is to understand the counterfactual that I think Gov's side must defend. One, I think it looks like more stoic social movements. They aim to not show an emotion in the ways in which they portray their message, because that's fundamentally one, performative, and two, not the supposed way in which you appeal to people on a rational basis, which seems to be what the OG wants on that side. Two, it looks like actively trying not to focus on a mass audience. So instead of bite-sized information that can be spread easily on social media, i.e. publicity, you go for things that are a lot more detailed and a lot like that I concede will show a fuller picture of the degree and nuance of the problem, but are also just less likely to spread because they're less likely to be sensational in nature. That means that they don't get things like pride parades. They don't get things like Black Lives Matter, like that encourages the explicit and performative expression of their anger as a core part of their protest movement. I think those are the reasonable grounds to take the debate on. I'll take a POI clarification if anyone has any at one. We're going to prove two things. One, why social movements need to give a space to individuals who want to be heard. And second, why we think that we maximize the broad coalition on our side of the house and therefore get actual social change. First, on giving a space for individuals, I want to frame this into debate first and foremost, because I think OG is incredibly myopic to assume that this debate is just about creating social change at the end of the day. There are two reasons why this is not true. One, in the interim that we get social change, i.e. until full equality happens, people are still going to suffer as a result of being a minority and being subject to interim discrimination. These are individuals who need support and need other ways in which we make their lives less hellish than just policy change. But secondly, note that some of the problems that minorities face are just inherent. As a transgender individual, you are going to face some degree of trauma that comes from the inherent nature of the gender-based confusion that you face, and therefore it is incredibly likely that there is still some degree of support that we should be trying to provide to these people. Why do we think we're able to protect the vulnerable on our side? We think that for people who suffer as an oppressed minority, there are three important things that we achieve, that they suffer from. The first is a fundamental denial of agency at a point that society limits the options that you have and limits your ability to actualize your full identity. Second, it looks like being put down by majorities, being told that you don't matter on a day-to-day basis. That's what people see at the point that police brutality, for example, treats people like they are worth less than other human beings for no reason than the color of their skin. In effect, the suffering that they face is from the society as a whole oppressing them and making them feel unwelcome. Why do we think we change this? Two important reasons. The first thing I think we achieve is the catharsis that comes from speech, empowerment, and reclamation of these spaces in the public sphere, whether it's physical protest or social media. That's because the very spaces where you feel oppressed in are places in which you are more likely to feel supported at the point that the movement encourages you to speak and reclaim these social spaces for yourself. This is the reason why, for example, women's marches that march through the street at night in order to reclaim the streets are so powerful for women within these movements. It looks like Black Lives Matter Plaza encouraging people to embrace their identity and assert their identity against majorities that screw them over on a day-to-day basis. This is the way in which we think we allow individuals to empower themselves in the status quo. But the second thing we achieve is explicit shows of support at the point that these are public. Things like shares and likes are not just shares and likes. They are active endorsements of your problems, understandings and legitimizations of the struggles that you face, and a commitment to make change from allies. That's incredibly important. It also looks like the ability to coalesce as a community, to feel like you are part of a collective that has the chance to fight together. That's hope, that's legitimization, and a feeling that you're not alone. Independent of whether change is going to come, that short-term ability to create these feelings for people, feelings of being supported for people, is incredibly important. The final thing I want to note is just that stoicism on that side of the house is actually incredibly privileged, because it assumes that that individuals are in a position where they don't feel oppressed to the point that they need to speak out on that side of the house. This is something that we avoid at the point that we legitimize the most vulnerable wanting to lash out and being willing to accept their lashing out in the status quo. Even if people might not want to be public, there are two things to note. One, we show that it's possible, and therefore we widen the degree of agency for them at the point that they have the option to speak like this. But secondly, movements tend to have space for these individuals as well, because while you have a publicly assertive stance, you can also have private, like separate movements that aim to serve the underprivileged of society. Look at the way LGBTQ movement marries pride parades with internal trans shelters, for example. No thanks. Secondly, why do we think we are able to maximize a broad coalition? This is important because I think what we get is we bring more allies on site, which means we are able to do things like changing mindsets of individuals who might not otherwise be educated or might not otherwise understand the degree of problem in the status quo. We convince them this is a priority and therefore push them towards things like protests, like electoral decisions to vote for your movement or vote for the left as a priority, to fundraise and donate to your movement, as the Black Lives Matter movement was so able to do. Why do we think we get this on our side of the house? I want to know the comparative on that side is that people need to actively go and find out about the movement because you necessarily have less spread. This is going to be significantly less spread because you're not sensational, and that means that you don't get media attention on things like pride protests, for example, nor do you get the social media virality because not enough people click and not enough people share, which means that the burden to entering is significantly higher, and that makes it all the more likely that you're only going to get this degree of attention from people who already buy into the ideology of the movement, i.e. the left-wing bubble that they wanted to talk about. But why do we think we achieve change on our side? The first thing we do is that we make people aware of the movement. The fact is that we are better able to emotionally connect to the degree of the problem when it's in your face because it's shared widely, but also when the nature of the sharing is very emotional in nature. I want to note in response, the actions of people to join a protest are not necessarily rational. They come from a guttural belief that you need to help someone else, that your emotions and your sympathies reach out to someone else. That's inherently emotional and something we exclusively get on our side. CG. No? Okay.
Do you not feel that the tendency for having a movement that focuses on allies creates the tendency of leaders of these movements to no longer be the folks that are that are most affected by these social movements themselves? For example, Black people in the case of BLM.
Well, no, I've just proven to you that I think we have a significant space for these individuals as well. But I think in terms of the echo chamber, right, in terms of this idea that it's just a sensationalist black square. First, I think we obviously have internal discourse about how and what to share and what strategies are most effective. But secondly, I think what this does is that it creates peer pressure to at least care for individuals. And the reality is, insofar as many individuals are see this kind of change, what we exclusively get is we only need some of these individuals to contribute meaningfully to actually make a difference. Whereas on that side, you've got less people who even interact, and therefore you need all of them to make significant degrees of change to their lives in order to make a difference. On our side, we further think that we get more discussions because we ensure that we're able to get in your face and therefore keep these issues alive with constant pride parades, for example. The comparative on that side is that your ability to solve things like subtle discrimination and microaggression just doesn't exist because you don't have publicity for your movement at a point that legislative change means that people think the issue is done. But we have consistent publicity and consistent performative efforts to get in your face. We keep these discussions alive and we ensure that we have a long-term ability to create awareness and change for these social movements. Thanks.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much, Leader of Opposition, for those remarks. To continue OG's claims in this debate, VPN, please. Hear.
And feel free to raise your hand or put POIs in the chat. 1 second, just my dog. There we go. All right, I will start now. So the first thing I want to say is that we need to actually have a debate. If opening opposition is going to run with the line that Black Lives Matter as a concept can't exist if you can't have performative discussions, then what they're saying is that social movements are inherently performative, which I think is kind of a patronizing conception of what social movements actually are, right? Publicity and performative displays is different from substantive actions, even if both get attention. The key is you can do a protest for the sake of protest, or you can do it for the sake of publicity, of just showing off that this thing has happened. The word performative implies the intention, that the focus is performance. We say that when you ask someone to donate to a bail fund or to go rail against the people in a government office, it's not because you want to put on a show for your supporters or a specific subset of people on social media. It's because you want the people to be freed from prison and you want the government to stop repressing the vote. It is directly confrontational to those in power and shows consequences to their actions. We defend a world in which this is the dominant function of social movements because we think that this is something that actually leads to the perception that these movements can be efficacious and not just performative, so more people join them, but also the people who join them will actually help push things forward. Okay, I want to address two major concerns then in the speech. Number one is about non-political avenues for change. This is something that I think we can expand a little bit more on out of the Prime Minister's speech, directly engaging with OO's material, which is that it's not just about confronting those in power and getting political change, it's about changing the discourse more broadly. We think that we're better off in this regard in two separate respects. Firstly, we think that people who may call themselves allies are likely to internalize that performance alone satisfies their obligation to be anti-racist or to be pro-feminist. That is, you broaden the norm to accept a black square as a substitute for meaningfully contributing to these groups on their side of the house, when through the mechanisms that Brian gave you in the Prime Minister's speech, these are the things that millions of people actually see and affiliate with these movements on their side, because they, one, emanate from the core, but two, emanate from social media echo chambers, but then because the network effects of these movements are the things that actually get reaching a broad audience. This can be seen in a few real ways in our world right now, right? It's probably the fact that liberal identifying white people in the United States see more media in which people speak in African American vernacular English, which is an incredibly complex linguistic system. But that doesn't change the fact that in real world studies of Americans, white people who identify as liberals actually lower the grade level of the English that they're using when they speak to people who have a black sounding name than moderate American individuals who have less information about the racial divide. Because while they normatively or nominally learn that there is differences between the linguistic cultures of two different groups of people, what they didn't learn is that AAVE is a complex system, or that most black people are going to be able to conceive of the same kind of experiences that you are. So they end up talking down. They engage in more microaggressions, and the result is that people just see these outcomes as patronizing, right? When they see white people posting black squares and substituting that for meaningful activism, they don't see these people as allies in a way that actually contributes to their lives, just as allies in a way that enhances their social status. And so to that end, you don't actually get the in-group filiality that you need to get change. But second, and more importantly, on a structural level, and I think this is new substantive, we also think these movements are more likely to be co-opted on their side of the house. That is, there are entities that are in power, not just government entities, that benefit from existing structures, not existing individual actions that hold people down. This looks like corporations, for example, that discriminate against women and minorities when it comes to how much they pay them, or break up unions and break up strikes in order to hold people's wages down. But the key is on their side, when you create the norm that performative displays sufficiently satisfy the criterion for social justice, these same entities can then co-opt that language. They can put out the fact that they support the gay pride flag, or put out the fact that they support Black Lives Matter in terms of the name of the movement, but literally nothing else. And people are simply less likely to scrutinize these very same institutions and hold them accountable for the material harms that they have contributed. This looks like the literal corporatization of formerly progressive labor parties that you see in much of the Western world, that resulted by these corporate entities rebranding themselves as paragons of social justice, even though they were not making material contributions to changing these things, or the fact that McKinsey and Company is contributing to families being separated at the border, while at the very same time saying that they stand for immigrant rights. We think on our side, when you don't create this norm, you're more likely to interrogate these actors, and even if you don't get political change, you can still hold individual actors accountable by calling attention to the things that they have done to minorities, by holding strikes, by forming unions, and by having collective action. Quickly closing.
On
Yeah,
your side
when
of the
people
house,
posted the black squares on Instagram, I saw a lot of people doing so who would never engage with concepts of racial justice otherwise. You can have social movements that aren't performative on your side, but you need to accept that they would be substantially smaller and reach fewer people because they don't activate people's emotions in the same way.
Two things. One, I question that the people who would have done literally nothing else except for posting a black square would ever meaningfully contribute to these movements. I don't know that you actually get an impact off of this. But second, the reason why activists from the movement ultimately ended up turning against the black square phenomenon after it got out of control is because it was literally crowding out other social media content about literal bail funds that were going to free people who are locked up for exercising their democratic right to protest. So I think given the trade-off between having 10 posts about bail funds at the top of your feed or 50 black squares, I take the 10 posts about bail funds because the first post has a link to donate and that money helps people on the ground. I also think that minorities see this real world activism and real world contribution as more meaningfully indicative of the fact that these movements can be efficacious. So then, the second thing I want to talk about is how we just get more widespread support and why, critical mass actually is important for political change and we can't write it off. Remember that the counterfactual we're defending is focusing on substantive changes. Brian told you that mechanistically, you're less likely to get the information that's substantive out if you're focused on performative displays, because performative displays tend to be, one, more sensational, and two, because of the reason that we just heard from CO, there are a lot of people who are going to just overwhelm the airwaves with these performative displays who may not have shared this other content, but the problem is it's crowding out, even if it's a smaller amount of substantive content. We think that this substantive content getting to the forefront is good because it allows people to turn out for actual protests, right? It allows people to make actual contributions. And even if they're not focused on spreading the word in terms of videos of those protests after they happen, we told you that, again, mechanistically, there are still reasons why this information will get out. There are other institutions that exist to serve this role. The media probably covers these protests. And the fact of the matter is that if you have a larger protest in the first place, or you have a contribution to bail funds that is so large that it warrants the attention of the media, then it probably means that higher figures in the movement get elevated and now have a platform to share a more nuanced viewpoint on their movement, to actually talk about this beyond what's in a 10-second TikTok video and explain to people why they're fighting for real progressive change. But that never happens on their side when the content that you need to achieve this gets crowded out. The other thing we told you, though, is that we just get more people on our side. Firstly, on account of moderates who probably will not affiliate with the content that came from the core of the movement that tends to skew more radical. They don't connect with it, so they don't join because they don't see the movements as effective. And secondly, because people both internalize the fact that these movements are performative, and second, externally, they see the movements as performative, so they do not join. So on all accounts, both people are less likely to join, but also those who do join are less likely to be engaged and more likely to bow out. The smaller your coalition, the less of an ability you have to change the structures in power that oppress minority groups. Aesthetics are simply not enough.
All right, thank you very much for the Deputy Prime Minister for those remarks. And to close the opening half of this debate, Diallo, please. Here.
Hi, can I just check that I'm audible?
Yep, very clear.
Just give me a few moments, sorry.
Sure.
I'm just not very persuaded by OG's attempt to opt out of this debate because they don't explain why their so-called specific end goals and specific protests aren't likely to suffer from the same problems that they talked about, the same sort of misrepresentation, the same sort of echo chamber in terms of social media. But let's take them at their best. I'm going to still explain why, even if these things are done strictly for the purpose of expressiveness or publicity, why they still in and of itself better than all of the things that OG talks to us about. The first problem, I think, coming from the OG case is they don't actually provide a mechanism as to why trying to have specific protests that are oftentimes antagonistic is likely to get you any sort of change in the first place. Number one, I suggest it's far harder you're going to get any sort of change because these sort of specific protests against specific policies are likely to be the ones that cut the deepest and the hardest against things that privileged individuals on the ground currently care about, right? So if you say that taxation policies are the things that you want to go for straight away, these are the things that people are most likely to resist. Comparatively, when you appeal to things like their visceral emotions, that we are both humans, these are things that don't directly challenge individuals and a conception of their existing identities. They don't take individuals out of their existing comfort zones, which means that individuals are far more likely to buy into your conceptions of your movement and therefore support you there. These specific protests you want therefore can come after you've already sold them on your story, but not before. There's a problem-solution mismatch that gets there. I'm going to do two things within this speech. Firstly, I'm going to explain why that critical mass is important, debunking all of the stuff OG gives you. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about why the ability to express yourself is in itself an important outcome that I think OG does not respond to coming from Sean's speech. Number one, why is that critical mass important? And I think the first thing that OG does that's extremely dismissive is to suggest that people do this for nothing more than aesthetics, or likely to care about nothing more than aesthetics. They oftentimes, the existence of the movement itself oftentimes signifies the commitment that individuals on the ground have made in order to be and turn up at these like pride parade parties, pride parades, for example, or whatnot, right? They oftentimes you show individuals that you are number one, actual individuals that have problems that you need to care about. That you prevent the majority on the ground that's there's been conveniently ignorant of many of the problems that individuals on the ground are currently facing and shock them out of that convenient ignorance. That you force individuals to have to challenge that the social norms that have created harm to other individuals that might live right beside them in many of these instances. We posit that these are real individuals and not the invisible minority that we tend to assume they are. And I think this already in itself shifts a lot of the individuals who do genuinely care, but I think oftentimes ignorant or just unaware of the problems that many of these individuals face. But the second is this, right? That you are just more likely at the point where you get a huge conglomeration of people at many of these expressive or public events to recognize that there are just literally so many individuals within society who might suffer from these same problems. These might be the individuals who are literally right beside you or your friends and families, and are more likely to make you as an individual on the ground, majority on the ground, to care about such things, right? And here's the comparative, I think specifically that Sean makes that I don't think OG wants to deal with, which is that I think on our side, even if we get one more person on the minority side and we get 10 other people pushing back, then I think it's still a comparative win for us. Why? Because I think minorities on the ground oftentimes used to and have had to deal for their entire lives with entire societies and entire communities pushing back against them. Having a few more individuals out there isn't going to make a significant and different change to them. Comparatively, however, for many of these minorities, the existence of a single ally is something that's hard to come by and takes huge amounts of effort to create in the first place. Therefore, I think being able to get a single person that helps you and is willing to contribute and commit to that cause is something that's proportionally more important to many minority movements on the ground as it stands. But secondly, I want to engage their most dismissive and convenient claim here, which is that black squares don't matter and aren't important. Number one, to the extent to which I recognize that oftentimes these black squares are not non-committal and don't have the same sort of commitment levels, I suggest that these are of themselves useful things and good things within the debate. The first and the reason why this is important is because it shifts the narrative of the ignorant or the passive majority onto a less antagonistic side, right? At the very least, they believe genuinely, they believe on a surface level there might be not some need to care about the black lives, for example. There might some need for you to be less discriminatory. The converse and the problem that they don't deal with here right now is that the existing narrative of the ignorant majority or the passive majority is one that slants away from minorities on the ground. It's one that says that it might not be that wrong for you to bully or to discriminate against minorities on the ground because everyone does it anyway. In a world in which more and more black pages show up, where you recognize that your friends and families out there might actually be the very individuals who look down upon you for the antagonistic actions and the discriminating actions that you do, individuals are more likely to actually watch themselves and not do these things because the rest of society seems to generally be against that sort of narrative and that sort of movement right now. But be that individuals themselves might actually turn, like, insofar as they buy into larger societal narratives and want to be a part of their larger societal narrative there. Then it's in itself, I think, a definite actual outcome at the point you're actually able to protect individuals on the ground, and the point that individuals become more resistant to acting out or more resistant to being discriminatory in the first place. But the second is this, right? Don't let them pretend that the black squares aren't actually things that created actual tangible benefits on the ground, right? Literally, when we saw in the advent of the Black Lives Matter movement and we saw black squares that they talked about, there was huge contributions of money to many of these people, right? Individuals, for example, contributed huge amounts of royalties from the music and the games that they sold, for instance. And that money is an actual tangible and definite benefit that they can't deny on the side. There's money that goes into actually being able to set up more shelters on the ground that protect individuals in vast majority of instances. That publicity directly leads to money that's important for the resources to protect individuals in many of these instances. But secondly, right, I think what happens here is that, like, the mass movement and the critical mass is important in making individuals on the ground feel less antagonistic against you, right? The problem in status quo right now is that people feel like they can marginalize you because you are small, that you are alone, that you have no community, or that your community is weak. The majority now believes that you can just like scare people into submission and that discrimination is something that will not hit back at them. I think what you do at the point that you show that there's huge degree of public mass and critical mass is that you enable individuals to, like, is that number one, you directly bound individuals who might otherwise feel that same thing, right? As the only gay person within your company, for example, it is very easy to feel scared and alone in those instances. What you tell people now is that number one, you have an actual community that stands behind you that you might be able to turn to. But the second is that the rest of society is just a lot less likely to be a lot more wary in a world in which they know that community is far larger, in which there are actual repercussions that can happen because of the huge mass they have, even if not in politics, within these small inner circles that individuals otherwise have there. I think that's why these parades and these public events are important insofar as that's the case. But I want to also talk about expressiveness and the ability to express yourself, because this is something that I don't think OG deals with at all coming from Sean's case, right? And that's why OG is going to lose, because they ignore the reality that there are many individuals on the ground for whom the expressiveness is important. The ability to just be able to express yourself is important. This means that the more that OG talks about antagonism within this debate towards expressiveness, that's precisely why we need to have the movement or the emphasis on the movement doing that sort of public expressiveness instead of quo. Because we need to offload the duty, we need to ensure that individuals aren't the ones bearing the brunt of that antagonism and those attacks right now, right? That the community and the movement as a whole collectively is just far better equipped to deal with all of these things, right? like in many of these instances. But the last thing here is this, right? I think this is useful insofar, and this relates directly back to the first thing that I began this speech with, right? That I think oftentimes what you try to do too hard at the point where you don't want to create publicity first is that you force individuals to accept a binary decision that you either give us that political change or we're going to keep pushing you against for it. I think the problem is that it's oftentimes incredibly hard to sell individuals on a finalized outcome or a clear and tangible outcome that might otherwise hurt their lives. The difference here is that we sell them an image and a narrative that they're likely to be able to easy and palatable for them to buy into and be able to slowly change their internal narratives and the mindsets that they otherwise have from within in a way that's far more palatable.
All right, thank you very much, Deputy Leader of Opposition, for those remarks. To begin the closing half of this debate, Member of Government, please. Here.
Yeah, so for POIs, you can put them in the chat. If I still don't take one by 6 minutes, you can also like turn your camera on and wave your hand or something. And I'll try and take one by that particular point in time. And for timer as well, I'm going to be timing myself, but it'd be great if folks could put it in the chat as well. 1 second. Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what is important for social movements? Social movements are trying to mobilize the largest number of people who are plugged into a radical politic, but not only are they trying to mobilize the largest number of people possible, but mobilize these people for the largest amount of time possible. Why is time uniquely important in social movements? Time becomes uniquely important in social movements because the purpose of social movements is not just to coalesce a broader public around a particular social issue, but also to coalesce a broader public for the sake of actual policy change to take place. The unique extension that closing opposition basically brings to this particular debate is the idea of the fact that a lot of the times what happens with public expressivism and the kind of like the kind of less radical politic that develops around this idea of presenting yourself within the public sphere is the fact of like the intellectual division of a social movement between public sphere and actual policy change. So what happens oftentimes with things like BLM being changed into movements that surround things like Black squares on Instagram is not just the fact that larger numbers of moderate people basically swath the idea of black posts over the concept of like funding, but what also happens is the fact that these social movements are divided across lines of like having the presence of these movements in public spheres like Instagram versus having the presence of these movements in things like social like policy change, like the governance, right? And this works really, really well, we tell you, for radical politicians, especially people on the right wing, because what they get to do is also mobilizing these particular cases and coalesce support around BLM, etc., by posting by posting black squares as well, because they're able to create like intellectual divisions of these social movements between public space on social media sites versus like public space in actual politicians like rooms versus actual public space in like policy change and legislation. And we feel like this kind of like radical division of these kinds of movements into spheres of policy versus spheres of like public activism become radically dangerous when you're trying to like include one larger movement, trying to mobilize larger number of people, and also create substantive change that is policy oriented, right? With that, let's move on to the issues within this particular debate and tell you why proposition wins all of these issues and bring in unique extensions within the kind of refutation that I also present within this particular model. So let's start with the first particular kind of example that we're trying to talk about. So first thing we need to talk about is who mobilizes the largest number of people within this particular scale, right? So not only is this an issue of like mobilizing the largest number of people where opposition might think that you might be able to mobilize a large number of people. One, we fundamentally disagree. Why is it that you're not able to mobilize a large number of people? We feel like what often happens with like public expressivism is that you create disorganization within this particular politic. So you might have things in like within BLM where people understand BLM to be something about black squares, to be something about a racialized politic, but they don't understand what is it that they're actually advocating for. So when it comes to understanding things like the fact that people actually want to defund the police or abolish the police versus, for example, things like reform the police, people are not able to coalesce around these actual changes. So you might have hundreds of thousands of people now support the idea of some kind of a Black Lives Matter movement, but not actually understand that the demands of these movements surround the idea of, for example, like radicalizing people to abolish the police eventually. And we feel like it's exactly this kind of disorganization that allows for right-wing politicians to get away with, for example, doing the bare minimum of saying that we also care about racialized politics when they actually don't want to, for example, abolish the police place, which is the exact reason for why this movement started in the first place. So really that on net, even if you have like a larger scale of mobilization, this mobilization is not going to come even if this mobilization comes, it's going to be a disorganized mobilization with people divided on actual policy changes that they want to adopt. But let's actually understand the fact that not only is this like mobilization not going to come, but if you do accept the fact that this mobilization happens, and a lot of the mobilizers that you do have are moderates in this particular case, right? And why are moderates uniquely bad for our particular example? We tell you that moderates are not only uniquely bad because they only care about the social media politic, because like the fact that why do people mobilize in the first place, right? People mobilize when they feel like an uncomfortability in the sense of their kind of politics that they're adopting, and they feel like they need to have some kind of change happen in the particular status quo, right? We tell you that it's exactly these kind of people that don't want to vie for policy change, and even if they do want to vie for policy change, they feel like the kind of social media contribution that they're making is enough. So when you make people think that public expressivism is like a radical politic, that's exactly when they might feel like this kind of like a radical politic is enough for them to engage in. So radicalism basically transforms from things like, for example, occupying, for example, being present in like public offices, or for example, voting like right-wing politicians out, into things like posting black stories on Instagram, right? So you actually move the scale of what radical is by engaging in the fact that this kind of politic is radical. So moderates don't even have to engage in a radical politic in the first place. But a second, you know what happens in the case of like moderates being organized in this particular case around these kinds of issues is that the actual people who these issues affect are likely to be transformed. And this is unique from what proposition has told you, because you tell you that black people, for example, that need to be centered and fronted in the case of like Black Lives Matter movements, or indigenous people that might be fighting for like occupation, the kind of colonization that has happened of the United States. You're going to change from these kinds of people to getting leaders that are rooted in these kinds of allies movements. Why? Because a lot of the kind of like public expressivism movements requires a kind of social capital that you have on to be able to post to Instagram. So a lot of white celebrities, for example, have this kind of social and economic capital that you need to be able to create the kind of change that you need. We tell you that black people, indigenous people, etc., don't have this kind of social capital in the first place, so they won't be able to engage in these public expressivism movements in the same way. Why is it harmful if you take like white allies and put them at the leadership of these movements and rather take away from black people or indigenous people in these cases? We think this is a unique path that you're going to engage in this particular case, because these black people are the ones that firsthand understand the problem, right? So black people are more likely to advocate for things like police abolition because they experience police brutality on an everyday basis, but they don't kind of have the social capital to engage in these public expressivist movements. This is unique from a proposition, by the way, because they never talked about the fact of who these leaders, or the movements of these leaders are, or who even is able to coalesce under this idea of public expressivism, right? So we tell you that you change the movement of these particular people. But let's move on to the second particular issue in these debates. Is like, not only is who are we able to mobilize, but what kind of movement do we end up creating? We tell you on propositions that what the kind of movement that you end up creating is a movement that's not oriented in policy. And why is that? We tell you that social media movements are short-lived. Why? Because they're trendy movements and they're likely to go out of fashion very, very quickly. When these movements go out of fashion, that also means that not only are these movements like short-lived, which means that actual policy change is not possible, but in secondary, you know that movements themselves have to compete against each other. So for example, Black Lives Matter now has to compete against Kashmir, which now has to compete against Belarus, which now has to compete against China, right? So you have this kind of competition that's created in the public intellectual sphere is uniquely bad for these movements, because you now have like different movements that could have gotten like public sphere, that could have shared this politic and like engaged with politicians on the front, like right-wing politicians, now have to compete for this kind of intellect, like kind of like social politic or social capital that's present on these social media spheres, right? So you have this kind of engagement creates like barriers and boundaries between these social movements and does not allow them to coalesce and come together in ways that are more effective for them. Not only is this a unique extension, but in a second, you know, we tell you that co-option by corporations is uniquely bad. So proposition in the like fleeting 1 minute tell you that corporations are really bad because they're likely to co-opt these movements. We tell you that this is not even enough analysis, and we're going to bring you like a unique extension within this corporation model as well. Why is the corporation model essential in this particular case? Corporation models are essential not only because corporations are likely to like co-opt these movements and use like radical, for example, say like pink war is good, or say like, oh, pussy hats or what feminism is about. But corporations, what they also do is they take this movement and make it less radical, right? So corporations are likely to bring a neoliberal angle to a lot of these movements and make them less radical than they are. For example, make the kind of like power analysis that's happening around environmental movements go from things like fucking corporations are bad to things like, oh, polluting the ocean, or like throwing your trash in like the water is, for example, bad. And we tell you that's exactly the kind of bad corporate mentality that exists. And the last note, we also tell you that herd mentality is something that uniquely exists in this particular models. Not only are you mobilizing a large number of people, but mobilizing people that are going to have like the same kind of mentality, so you don't have like different kinds of politics appear within this particular model. And for all of these reasons, both side proposition.
Right, thank you very much for the member of government for that, for those remarks. To open closing opposition's case, inviting the member of opposition to speak, please. Here.
Am I audible?
Yeah, very clear.
Awesome. On closing opposition, we're going to explain how the vast majority of people act without this performativity. Our case actually quite neatly interacts with closing government. Because here's the frame that's been missing in the round. Gov makes a lot of arguments about, you should be an activist, or you should mobilize to change politics and structural oppression. But most people don't have the capacity or wherewithal to do this type of stuff. People know that there's a problem in a lot of instances. Progressive people have intuitions about what's right and what's just, but they face a huge amount of learned helplessness. Like, the magnitude of the problem they've just learned about is huge. They've never been an activist before. This, I think, is 99% of most movements, are people who have good intuitions about the movement, but don't know what to do next. Our claim is that performativity overcomes the inherent collective action problems with organizing. People want an outcome, but they either don't want to change their behavior or they don't know how to change their behavior, so they end up not doing anything at all. This is why we get people who say they're feminists, for example, but don't actually do anything to advance the movement. That is what the comparative is. People get away with being publicly supportive of the movement by saying, oh yeah, I'm not a sexist at home and I do progressive things at home, when they actually don't do anything at all. Performativity makes it harder for people to get away with this type of watery commitment because they actually have to do things for once, i.e. perform something in order to be considered part of the movement. This forces them to create tangible behavioral changes, which might be marginal, sure, but are real in a way that literally nothing happens on their side of the house. Performative expressivism is quite literally a way for well-intentioned people to do something to support the movement in ways that are legible and coherent and, crucially, approachable. You just have to black out your Instagram. You have to tweet a hashtag. You have to donate on your Facebook event. You have to march in this protest. This gives people clear rules and guidelines about how they should behave when they otherwise publicly are progressive, but privately have no idea what they're supposed to do. Crucially, the costs are low. I actually disagree with the top half characterization, as these performative signals might polarize and alienate some people. I think that in a lot of instances, these performative signals are often uncontroversial examples of oppression, like a video of police brutality, which is why so many people are willing to share them in all their social medias. The implication, I think, is important here, because people who are often in quite inert or conservative social groups are more willing to display these posts because of their uncontroversiality, and that in turn makes people who otherwise never would have seen anything about this movement actually get exposed to a movement that gets more attention. Unfortunately for CG, this low cost also means that the time that people engage in the movement is much longer than the alternative. It's not hard to post the next trend or the next post and the next and so on. So every time something goes trending, you reactivate people who have publicly committed to that movement. On their side of the house, you advocate for some amorphous policy change, and the people who are average participants in the movement read one article and maybe go to a protest with a hat that says, I'm here for substantive reasons. But once they don't see anything change, I think the costs are too high for them to continue to commit it to a movement. The response to the POI that we gave OG, I think, damns them, because they say that the same actions can be used for different means, like protests can have substantive or frivolous ends. So the prerequisite is just getting people to those protests such that they can be leveraged for potentially substantive ends. From the perspective of the politician who sees thousands of people outside of their office, it could not matter less if 20% of them are there for the Instagram post, because from the perspective of that politician, all it looks like is a huge movement that is trying to advocate for a specific end. Why is this good? Performative expressist movements can set standards of acceptable behavior in a way that other movement strategies simply cannot. One, this gives legible instructions for the tens of thousands of average people who don't know what to do. I also think there's a feedback loop here, where one, these actions often encourage behaviors that get repeated over time. That makes it more likely that they are continually progressive. Crucially, this is a good transmission mechanism from people who are in the know about what's next to those who aren't. That funny Twitter account or that Instagram influencer who actually is an activist can actually more easily tell people what's next compared to some random activist on a hill who's saying, oh, we need to be more radical, we need to do sit-ins. I just don't think those people have as much bandwidth. Two, I think people's minimum thresholds for being a respectable member of their friend group is now higher. They have to do the black square in order to not seem racist. They have to do Blackout Tuesday, etc. This probably makes it more likely that the next trend that everyone's participating in, i.e. the network effects we hear from OG, means that you have to participate in them. So if you think about how these types of things have changed in the status quo, it was like first Blackout Tuesday, then it was like we should support Black-owned businesses, then it was things like we should donate to certain causes. Those types of things, that ratcheting up of behavior and expectations, is precisely the thing that makes people more and more committed over time. And I think that's much easier when people publicly commit on the first place. Third, I do think you're held publicly accountable for actions when you first post the first performative thing. So if you're racist next week, you are more likely to be socially sanctioned by your friends who are like, what are you doing? I thought you were not racist. This is the implication of the network effects argument of OG. If you notice that a peer isn't posting a certain post or isn't coming out in support of a movement, you are more likely to socially sanction them, question them, criticize them, etc. Number two, I do think you give a discrete target for criticism for what the movement is doing. On our side, you can say in a targeted way, that black square isn't enough. Here's what else needs to happen. And people often comply with those admonishments since they publicly tied their hands. They've committed to the movement, so they want to seem as if they are actually a woke person. I think it's substantially easier to adapt and amend organizationally what is appropriate in the movement compared to on their side when you have a bunch of well-intentioned people who literally don't know what they should be doing because there's no clear policy preference or there's no clear strategy that all activists want. I'll take a POI from OG.
So given that you just said that once the person posts the black square, you don't have to question whether they're racist or not. And this takes literally zero effort to do.
No,
Isn't
that's
it
not
at
what I
least
said.
marginally more likely that you had to prove that you made a substantive contribution to prove that you
That's not
actually
what I
care
said
about
at all.
these issues?
It publicly ties your hand to not be racist in the future. So if you don't actually do things that are woke, you are more likely to be subject to public criticism. I want to be clear about why that's important, because even if you're not certain why that, if that changes maybe public behavior, behavior between you and your friends and random individuals, this certainly ties the hands of very powerful people like politicians and corporations. I think this is a very clear way of holding public people accountable, because when they don't commit to these signals, they look like they're racist. But crucially, if they don't substantially contribute to anything in the future, it's a very easy way to have something to compare against. When McKinsey claims that they want to help Black people and they never end up doing those things, they've actually tied their hands, and it's much easier to criticize them versus the alternative when they've made no claims about what their positions are. So you couldn't even say it's hypocritical. You couldn't even say it's a wherewithal for something to be worth criticizing. To be clear, this is really important because those types of fears about people losing business because you might go to a different place that is actually committing to anti-racist things, or because politicians might lose office because you go and vote them out, are real credible threats that are now in place because you've publicly tied the hands of powerful individuals who now have to commit to those things in a way they simply do not on their side of the house. Crucially, for any politician to look meaningfully progressive, they have to follow these minimum benchmarks, which doesn't exist on their side of the house. As a side note, this is the type of thing that improves the capacity of movements to actually advocate in the future, and I think that's a very good reason to vote closing opposition.
Thank you very much for the member of opposition for those remarks. To conclude closing government's case in this debate, government, please. Here.
All right. If people could just put POIs in the chat, that would be excellent. Panel, the most important thing for a social movement isn't starting a conversation or attracting nominal support. It's about generating real change to address the proximate harms caused by the dire state of current affairs. Publicity and sensationalism and the performative wokeness that OP tries to tell you are actually good things decrease a movement's narrative control, as Iman tells you, and therefore decrease its ability to effectuate change. First, though, I just want to take out CO. What does CO tell you? The first contention that they make is that performativity makes it harder for people to get away with watery commitment, and it gives them a guidebook to action. I think that blacking out your IG, like Shreya suggests, is like the literal definition of watery commitment. That's them getting away with that watery commitment, right? I would sincerely like to know, and no opposition team has told you thus far in the debate, what blacking out your Instagram actually does to reduce police brutality. I don't think they ever get any sort of meaningful actual policy change on their side of the house from those types of watery commitments. But also, let's just take their like best case. Suppose someone drives all the way to a protest and engages in like hours of protest just for a photo for their Instagram, which I think is going to be a relatively small amount of people, especially now that you give them the out of being able to just post a black photo and get that credit for it, like they tell you on side opposition. Suppose that someone like makes that significant investment, right? We tell you that like that's not good either, because then that person drives home away from the protest and feels like they've done enough, feels like they don't need to go actually like read up on like what the Black Lives Matter movement is about, what they need to be doing like as a non-Black person to dismantle systems of like white supremacy, right? On their side of the house, they only ever get a very shallow engagement where like, yes, they chant Black Lives Matter at like Civic Center, but they don't actually do anything to decrease like these structural forms of oppression. The second thing Shreya tells you is that New hashtags reactivate old allies 6 months down the line, so there's no problem with short-term time commitments like Iman tells you, right? But even if this is true, we say that this does nothing for the movement because you need sustained commitment to write laws, get them passed, etc., not just once every 6 months commitment. It's very easy for a politician to look outside their window, see 20,000 people and do nothing if those 20,000 people vanish tomorrow and don't return for another year. Even worse, we tell you that, again, it gives the impression that you have done something while having done nothing. So now you get narratives like, why do you keep bringing this up to your Black friends that don't like stop talking about Black Lives Matter because they're still being impacted by it? Or I've done my part, I don't need to do more, I don't need to make more sacrifices. So you get less commitment overall in the long run. Finally, they say that people do the black square not to be racist, so it like forces participation in the movement from people who otherwise wouldn't participate. I think that that's actually really bad for two reasons. First, I think that it actually makes it net harder to call out your friends when they are racist, because people think that they misheard you when you say something problematic, or that you made a mistake rather than that you ascribe to a bad belief system. They don't think they need to challenge you because they think that you're one of them. They think that you're woke. They think that like maybe you might make an error, but you're fundamentally a good person opting into a good belief system. So they don't give you the same level of pushback on those beliefs. But second of all, making people feel forced to post something is actually not a good thing, because it means that first of all, they have an oppositional relationship to the movement and they feel resentful towards it. But second of all, they're never forced to meaningfully engage with and reconcile with why they feel forced, why they aren't doing more, because they get a pat on their back from their weak actions. All right. First point of collapse then on narrative control. Iman tells you that the most important thing a movement can do is control the narrative surrounding it, because that is the world in which they appear organized and reasonable and prevent others from strawmanning the cause. When the emphasis is publicity, we tell you that there's an encouragement for people who aren't leaders, experts, or authorities to speak on a movement. What does Iman tell you this results in? She tells you that this results in a bifurcation where you get co-optation and sensationalist radicalization at the same time. First, she tells you that corporations that engage in performative expressivism co-opt the movement and make it seem more moderate, right? I think that rainbow capitalism is the best example here, right? You get like a shallow engagement, but it's also an engagement that doesn't work towards inclusion and prioritizes like the wealthy and those perceived to have palatable identities, i.e. you get like a LGBT movement where you sell a lot of gay pride t-shirts and like target rompers, but never include like Black trans women. Iman also tells you that shifting the understanding of the movement makes just like even center-left ideas seem radical, not responded to by closing opposition. The second thing she tells you is that you get hashtags that are meant to gain a lot of publicity and attention that are necessarily sensationalist, i.e. hashtag abolish the police rather than hashtag drastically reduce police funding and replace many functions with social services. That makes the movement seem overly radical and deter those like with the actual capacity to effectuate change, right? We tell you that progressives on either side of the house are going to support progressive movements. The people key to this motion are moderates. Iman tells you that moderates like comfort and these sensationalized hashtags that get a lot of publicity are usually things that people are not comfortable for most of the people that are doing fine in SWO, the moderates that are that swing vote, right? This makes the association with the movement politically toxic for politicians who are in swing districts, who are also the ones who make it so that you get like a majority of the votes on a police accountability that would have failed before. So you never get support from the most important actors because they fear backlash and associational toxicity, right? This outweighs what opening government tells you, because they discuss actors with like greater because we discuss actors with greater capacity for change than like the people posting black squares, which doesn't who don't usually talk about racial justice. But also just like intuition pump this, the movement has experts. They're best able to advocate for their own interests. They're only able to talk for themselves on our side of the house. I'll take a POI from opening up.
Right. On our side, we can link information through these methods, and we just need some people to feel emotionally compelled to act in order to create the change that you want. How do you convince moderates who currently don't even know about the movement to care, especially when it's unsensational and therefore they don't know what's going on?
I think that it is better to have a moderate that doesn't care about Black Lives Matter than to have a moderate that is opposed to Black Lives Matter because they think that they are going to take away the police that will help them if they get mugged. That's what they get on their side of the house because they allow for that straw manning. Second point of collapse then on the capacity to effectuate change. So opening opposition tells you that like even if the movement fails, they've demonstrated legitimacy and support for these minority groups. I think that that's actually incredibly dangerous because people think that a change has been made, that justice has been done, as I say in my rebuttal to CO, right? This is just natural. People want to feel like they've won, like they've achieved something. But the role of a social movement is to change an intolerable status quo, and anything less than that is a failure. Like congrats. OO says that African Americans know that white people will hold up a sign for them, but the police are still committing murder and getting away with it. And now people are less outraged because they think that they've at least started a conversation or changed the culture or done something, right? This is also why the idea that making racism or sexism more unpalatable just doesn't matter. You get rid of the overt prejudice at interpersonal levels that is ultimately far less harmful than the subtle forms of institutional prejudice like voter disenfranchisement or redlining. We say that the state has a far greater capacity to materially affect your life than some random yokel, and that's where we care about change being made. You decrease the capacity to make real, lasting change. You increase the capacity that people just wash their hands and say they have done enough. For all these reasons, proud to propose.
Right, fantastic. Thank you very much for the government for those remarks. To closing opposition's case in this debate, I'd like to invite opposition to speak. Here.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Very clear.
All right. I want to begin by responding to CG. My overall response to their case is that they don't warrant why radicalism is good. They just say radicalism is good because it's good. And second, they're unduly dismissive of the attitudinal changes that do actually change how people perceive race and perceive structural injustice. Attitudinal changes, such as thinking that police brutality is a problem, changes how people vote, it changes how people donate, it changes how people interact with other people. The fact that they just say that this is nonsense and nothing is honestly kind of offensive, to the point that this is something that actually the movement has been desiring to change, i.e. trying to reduce implicit racism and microaggressions. That's been an enormous success of Black Lives Matter and reducing the amount of racial tension in society. I think a couple of things about this case in general, why radicalism is actually bad for this movement and that incrementalism is better. Because one, the higher costs of radicalism, i.e. supporting some sort of communist abolitionist movement, means that the collective action problem that we told you on our extension is raised. The average person sees this as a much higher commitment action, so they're much more disincentivized from participating. And if they do hold these types of intuitions, they just pass the buck on to other people who they think are more willing to participate. Second, it means that the movement is actually way more easily strawmanned, which is what they talk about on their side. If it's just 20 radicals talking in a room about how Brezhnev or whatever is like the solution to what we need to do in the United States, this is ridiculous on face to a wide swath of society who could then dismiss this movement as being too radical to be worth engaging with. The thing CG misses is that it's a prerequisite to change people's attitudes before you can get this type of substantive policy change. I think the entire government bench doesn't have a mechanism as to how this actually happens. Just saying radicalism is good is not a solution. When they talk about things like narrative control and that getting out of watery commitment is bad, it means a couple of things that they miss. One is that means, like now on our side, right, more people are exposed to these issues and then can be activated. That is to say, if they now know that people are interested in solving this problem, this is a person who can then be activated into supporting radical change in the future. Otherwise, they don't have a commitment that allows them to be activated. Second is when they say these people wouldn't read up on theory after like attending the protests. Obviously, somebody who is not willing to post a black square or is only willing to post a black square and not take steps further would obviously not be willing to like read Franz Fanon on their side of the house. Again, there's no mechanism. Then they say in the second speech that you shouldn't feel forced to participate in the movement. This is a huge concession that people feel like there's a cost involved with movements. They would feel a lot more forced by people trying to tell them that they have to be radical rather than people saying that they need to endorse relatively uncontroversial things. This also deals with their backlash argument because we said that more uncontroversial things get shared, which raises the overall standard of behavior across all friend groups, not just radical ones who would probably behave the same on either side of the house. I think to the extent that they don't provide warrants as to why things like neoliberalism are it's like the scary buzzword, but they don't actually provide a warrant as to why changing the behavior of corporations is so bad, then I think that there's just not enough material here to think that this case is worth voting for. I think that in general, corporations have changed their internal practices now because they need to compete for social expectations. That is, they need to recruit people who think that corporation is acting in a woke way. So they do change their internal practices to like make it easier for people to come out, for example. I think that is a substantive goal. That is the type of real policy change that has happened as a result of the attitudinal performativity that we think is so good about social movements. I want to talk about what the motion actually says. The motion has two parts, okay? So one, it talks about publicity. Regarding OG and also to an extent CG, I think what they miss is that this publicity is a prerequisite to the more substantive commitments that they ask for. What they miss is that publicly participating in protests is a tactic for our side, but also publicly participating in things like social media sharing is a prerequisite for you to do something like donate or call to your make a call to your senator. It's unclear why somebody would be willing to do that if they aren't willing to be activated by something like a post on Instagram, right? This is how you break the ice with individuals and then allow them to take the next step further. The second part of the motion and the second part of our extension is why performativity is counterintuitively good. We think performativity gets a really bad rap and it gets overlooked in its dimension to actually make people perform, like the actual meaning of the word. Because there's a couple of things involved with performativity. One is that it has a clear standard of action. So if somebody is doing something in a performative environment, then everybody has to do that thing. And second is that it actually also holds people accountable, because if you don't do that thing, then you don't actually get the type of respect that you want as somebody who supposedly or putatively has anti-racist commitments. I also want to say that this behavior is inherently escalatory in the sense that the commitment involved with performativity will increasingly get bigger in cost over time. This is why things like my relatively moderate relatives, when they saw all the BLM protests, before they were probably like, yeah, I'm an anti-racist, but then they started donating to BLM or the NAACP because this is escalatory. Performativity then gets us the best of both worlds. On the one hand, it gets us a minimum standard of behavior for individuals in all types of different social groups, but also on the other hand, it gets us ways to hold people accountable. This is the way their argument is not actually sufficient to engage with our extension, where we tell you that we get both of these desires at the same time. Because on the one hand, we are making people actively engage in a way that they didn't before and give them a minimum threshold for entry, but then we also provide a standard by which they can be evaluated, and then that standard escalates over time. Now, I want to do comparisons with OG and OO. Before that, I'll take CG.
Yeah, so what you miss on your side of the house is that this isn't about radicalism or incrementalism. This is about people seeing your movement looking disjointed and disorganized because there's no cogent narrative about what it stands for.
I think that increasing radicalism probably makes this problem a lot worse, because then you have all the leftist infighting that is notorious on that side. I think that that's not a very good argument. Okay, let's talk about OG. I think I have two general comments that I've already alluded to. One is that publicly participating in things like protests is probably a tactic on our side of the house. You want to do it for publicity reasons and performative reasons, but also they just don't have a mechanism. They pull people's attendance at these protests out of a hat. They just say people are going to be substantively engaged with the movement. How? I don't know. They don't actually say. What we say is that the type of incrementalist publicization of these issues is how you break the ice with people so that they can be more amenable. If they just saw a post asking them to donate without any context for why that's an issue and how that affects people, they're definitely not going to be donating on their side of the house. I think that just means OG can't win this round. Now let's talk about OO, why we're different, why we go above them. One is that our frame explains
Sorry, cannot. Sorry. I think your audio just dropped. We can't hear anything. Yeah. Yeah, 6:34 on my clock. No worries.
Okay, I think my Bluetooth headphones died. Can you hear me now?
No, Ken. No good.
Okay, really sorry about that. You said 6:30. It was at the top of the comparisons with OG?
With OO.
OO, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay, so I'll have about 45 seconds left. Okay. So our frame explains the comparative. Most people have intuitions about progressivism, but they need to be activated because of the collective action problem. This breaks the deadlock of top half, where OG says people need to be involved substantively. OO says, well, maybe not. We explain why we can allow both things to happen at once and why publicity is a prerequisite for substance desired by OG. Also, OO doesn't really weigh why the larger community that they talk about is so good relative to the other benefits that are possible. I think a lot of their benefits hinge on a community, not a huge one. Insofar as movements are interested in changing people's behavior, the arguments that explain uniquely why we can change people's behavior by giving them avenues of criticism, but also minimum thresholds for what is acceptable, that is going to be the winning argument of this round, because that's how you actually change people's behavior on the ground, rather than just maybe we make the community a little bit bigger. That's why I think we go above opening, and that's why I'm really proud to be on CO.
Right, thank you very much, Opwip, for those remarks. Thank you very much, all speakers. It was truly excellent octofinals debate. This is a close round OA, so feel free to leave the room after this. If you have any questions regarding the results, feel free to shoot us a message in Discord or anything like that. Good luck once again to all of you, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for judging.